For this video, we will be discussing values. So while the video about framework was about how we think about ethics, this video will be about what we think about when we think about ethics. Today, we will be discussing 4 values that may be familiar to you if you've taken a research or clinical ethics class. They are autonomy or respect for persons, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Before we get into the values themselves, I want to talk about where these values come from. The first document we pull these values from is the Hippocratic Oath, which famously states that doctors should not harm their patients. The second document related to these values is the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code is part of the United States v. Karl Brandt Nuremberg Military Tribunal decision after World War II. It outlines when and how human experimentation can be ethical. It was never written into law or official guidance, but it is a cornerstone document. The Declaration of Helsinki expanded on some of this work. It was written in 1964 by the World Medical Association. This is not a law, but it has been written to create guidance and regulation on national and regional levels. Then we have the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was written in the wake of public knowledge of the Tuskegee study. This was a study in which hundreds of Black men were not treated for syphilis when treatments were readily available. They were subjected to painful tests like spinal taps in order for investigators from the U.S. Public Health Service to see what happens when the disease wasn't treated. This, of course, caused the disease to also spread further into the community. Finally, there is the Common Rule. Common Rule takes concepts and values outlined in the Belmont Report and operationalizes them. This document is law within the United States and establishes things like IRBs and the process of informed consent. If you were to read any of these documents, this is the one I would not suggest. It is far longer, and because it is about operationalizing values, it deals more with policy. Instead, I would suggest reading the Belmont Report. Finally, a few takeaways from these documents. You always need to keep in mind the distinction between law, like regulation and legislation, and guidance, like codes, reports, and declarations. One is required to follow, and the other is a suggestion or an outline of an institution or organization's values. Another thing is that these documents are reacting to specific events in history, like Nazi human experimentation and American human experimentation. These documents are historically important and historically informed. And finally, these guidelines and laws are relatively recent, and some of them are semi-frequently updated. This history is recent, these documents are recent, and in many ways, these are active conversations, particularly if we start considering how these values relate to new technologies and new research methodologies. Now let's get into the values themselves. The first value I will talk about is respect for persons or autonomy. The defining parts include that people need to be treated as autonomous agents, meaning that they have the ability to govern themselves and their decisions. Additionally, people with diminished autonomy are entitled to additional protections. Examples of autonomy in action are that researchers must obtain a subject's permission to share their research data. This is because a research subject must have the ability to govern themselves, and that includes information about themselves. Another example is that research done on employees, children, incarcerated individuals, and other people with diminished autonomy is subject to additional scrutiny. An employee, for example, may have a diminished autonomy because they are worried about being fired if they do or do not participate in a research study. The next value is beneficence. Defining points of beneficence include that people need to be treated in a way that aims to help their well-being. Effectively, this is a value that calls you to maximize benefit and minimize risk. So, an example of beneficence in action is that researchers must design research experiments so that the lowest possible risk is incurred by the research participant. And now we have non-maleficence, which is basically do no harm. If you analyze a problem with beneficence in mind, it will likely also cover non-maleficence. These are two sides to a very similar coin. So an example here is that it is not ethical to use placebos, generally speaking, while testing the efficacy of a new drug when there is already a known treatment. You cannot withhold accepted treatment to test a new one. And finally, there is justice. The defining points of justice is that the benefits and burdens of an action need to be distributed equally across a population. An example of justice in action is the ethical concerns about paying research subjects and how much. The concern here is that if research subjects are paid, then the burden of being a research subject will fall disproportionately on the poor. And now, before we talk about these values in action in the next video, I want you to take the time to consider some questions. First, how do these 4 values impact how you interact with patrons and why? Additionally, what kinds of activities do you perform in your role that may be impacted by these values? So, for me, for example, I think a lot about autonomy in my work in data curation. When I am talking to a researcher about the data that they would like to share, we are always sure to talk about how subjects were consented and what data can be shared in accordance to that informed consent process. We will talk more about informed consent in our next video.